Hello, and welcome to the global studios of the National Archives Foundation and our virtual program series. I'm Patrick Madden, the Executive Director of the National Archives Foundation. Through this foundation programming, we're pleased to open the virtual doors of the National Archives and share the holdings. More than 15 billion records, objects, films, photographs, and most importantly, the stories from our nation's past. Thank you for joining us today from home for another spirited conversation. Today, I'm delighted to add to our collection of Presidential Library conversations with the Ford Presidential Library and Museum. Our guest speaker will be taking your questions later in the program. So before we begin, I want to make sure you know how to ask your questions. We're going to be using the YouTube chat to the right of your screen. And just for a little practice, put your hometown and state in there, and I'll give you a shout out later on. Remember, you don't have to wait until the Q&A section to add your questions in there. Feel free to put them in at any time. Our featured speaker today is Donald Holloway. Donald is the curator for the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum. He came to the Ford Presidential Museum in 1996. Since then, he's helped curate and shape over 70 exhibits, including the centennial exhibits of both President and Mrs. Ford, as well as the renovations of the museum, the core exhibit in 1997 and 2016. He has a bachelor's degree of history and political science from Oklahoma Baptist University and a master's from Kansas, where he serves as adjunct professor teaching American history and ancient history. Don, welcome. Are you with us?
I am, Patrick. Thank you for having me.
Excellent. How are you doing? And most importantly, how's the staff doing? Are you guys reopened? There's obviously a lot of energy to get all these museums reopened. How are things there?
Well, we hope to share some of that energy and soon. The staff is doing well. They're eager to get back. The library is in phase one. And so some of the archivists are returning and doing some work on site. The museum continues in phase zero, but the numbers are trending our way. And so we hope in short order to be in a position where we can reopen the doors to the public.
Excellent, excellent. And we're excited because just this last weekend we were open in Washington, D.C., the headquarters or the rotunda, the Charters of Freedom are for a few hours on Saturday and Sunday. So we're testing all the systems here in Washington and eager to, like you say, open the doors all the way up to get the crowds back in and start engaging with the public. Yeah. Well, because of our situation, that's why we're doing this series, so folks can still learn and at least virtually experience the Ford Presidential Museum. So I know you've got a great program for us today. I'm going to turn the screen over to you and let you run through it, and then we'll come back, obviously, with some Q&A at the end.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. And Keneal, I think we can go right to this first slide and get started. I'm going to talk just a little bit about the library and the museum. I'm the curator, so you're going to get more Gerald Ford than you are brick and mortar in this presentation. But just a little bit about the library and the museum. In any case, at other presidential libraries, you might have the museum and the library separated in different buildings. I'm thinking of Eisenhower, but there they share the same campus. We're separated by a state. Our library is on the east side of the state, on the north campus of the University of Michigan, Gerald Ford's alma mater. The museum is 130 miles to the west in Grand Rapids. Gerald Ford's hometown and the heart of his 5th district, which he represented in Congress for 25 years. So we are unique among presidential libraries by having a facility separated in this way. And we can get into that in the Q&A as to just why that is. Let me just say that this unique situation is set up in no small part because of the unique way that Gerald Ford came to the presidency. And so one of the things that we find because of that unique entry into the presidency by Gerald Ford is that we have to introduce Gerald Ford to our people. He's not known in the same way that other presidents who ran full-throated campaigns for the office are. So if we go to the next slide, Keneal, thank you. I'm going to take you to the Oval Office on March 10, 1975, and set this up by recalling something that David McCullough said after he had published his biography on John Adams, by that point having brought two of our lesser known presidents, Harry Truman and John Adams, to a fuller attention of the American public through his successful books. He was being interviewed and asked by the interviewer, among the 20th century presidents, which president really needs to be known better by the American public? And without hesitation, McCullough said Gerald Ford. And so here we are, March 10, 1975, a rainy Monday, spring in Washington, and Gerald Ford is sitting behind his Oval Office desk, which he has occupied for 7 months by this point, talking to his chief of staff, Don Rumsfeld, and in the background, sitting in the caneback chair next to the Remington bust, is a fellow by the name of John Hersey. And John Hersey is a Pulitzer Prize winning novelist and journalist. He's working for the New York Times Magazine, and the magazine and Hersey have asked Ford for permission to follow him for a week during his presidency, and President Ford has agreed to that. The object was to write a lengthy story in the New York Times Magazine about Gerald Ford, because they said America needs to know more about their president. And the polling that was going on inside the Ford administration at this time and Ford's own sense confirmed just what the magazine was asserting, that Ford needed to be better known by the American people. He was well known inside the Beltway on Capitol Hill and in his 5th district. So if we go to the next slide, where he had run for office in 1948. And I love this image on the left of Ford leaning against the tractor tire, talking to the 3 farmers, they in their work dungarees, he in his lawyer suit, talking to them. It's one of the things that the district came to know very well about Gerald Ford, much of which they already knew because he was well known in Grand Rapids. They knew him in his district as a hard worker, as a straight shooter, as somebody who who had no pretense about him, that he was a good listener, that he was someone who kept his word. And so here he is, the attorney, talking to the farmers, not pretending to be a farmer himself, but listening to them and promising that if they send him to Congress, that he would carry their concerns with him to Capitol Hill. And the 5th district, these farmers, along with the 5th district, turned out in the primaries the seated Republican representative of the 5th district, replaced him with Gerald Ford, and then in November of 1975, he won the general election, and November of 1948, he won the general election and then was off to Congress, where those on Capitol Hill learned the same things about Gerald Ford, that he was a hard worker, that he kept his word, that he was a good listener, that he had a sharp mind. And the leadership on Capitol Hill among Congress and among the Republicans rewarded him with important positions early in his career. By 1951, he was on the Appropriations Committee. By 1953, the Republicans come into a majority, and he's given charge of the subcommittee that oversees the Army's budget. So on that image on the right, you see him with military personnel at the DMZ in South Korea. He, during these early days of the Cold War, when America is establishing bases in the Pacific and in Europe, he's traveling the globe, attending to the Army's needs, listening to them, seeing how they spend their money, reporting back to Capitol Hill, and helping craft their budget. 1956, he's given oversight of the CIA. He's placed on that committee. And 1957, he's placed on the select committee that helps craft the legislation that establishes NASA. 1963, Lyndon Johnson reaches out to him as one of 2 members in the House of Representatives to sit as commissioners on the committee that is investigating the assassination of President John Kennedy, the Warren Commission. So if we go to the next slide, he, to use his own phrase, he decided early on, after counsel by some of his mentors on Capitol Hill, that he was going to be a workhorse, not a show horse, not somebody who was going to make his name by giving speeches on the floor, but somebody who was going to make his name by hard work on committees and learning the ropes of Congress, the mechanics of Congress. He was known for his constituent service, and that's what we see him doing on the left-hand side. He's eating lunch, sitting at his desk, reading constituent mail. He kept a small staff, and he had a standing order that all constituent phone calls and letters would be answered within 24 hours. His constituents in his district appreciated that, and in 13 elections, they returned him to Congress each time with not less than 61% of the vote. He kept a diary we call it at the library the Ford Diary. It's not really a diary, it's an aggressive desk calendar, you might say, where he jotted down notes, not every day, but often, and we get a sense of his workflow. And for him, it was not a Monday to Friday job, it was a Sunday to Saturday job. So he was often in the office on Saturdays and Sundays. He would take the kids with him. They would play in Statuary Hall with other congressional kids from other congressional leaders. And sometimes he would have them setting his typewriter, typing letters to their mother, telling her how much they appreciated her. He earns a reputation for bipartisanship. And to the extent that we know something of Gerald Ford, often that's a term that's used to describe him. He's Mr. Bipartisan. And he was. He worked well with people on both sides of the aisle. But it does us well to remember that he was partisan. He had a partisan side to him as well. He was a Republican who sought leadership. His ambition was to be Speaker of the House, and he begins moving into leadership. And we see him here in 1966 with the Republican leader from the Senate, Everett Dirksen, on what became known as the Evan Jerry Show. And there, before the television cameras, before the press, they would help promote the Republican agenda on Capitol Hill and take shots at President Johnson also. And so he moves into leadership. By 1964, he sets his sights on the speakership, and his Republican delegation is rewarding him at every turn. So if we take if we go to the next slide, there we see him in his Alexandria home dining room with his family. He with Betty and their 4 kids. The kids were born, Mike, the oldest, in 1950, Susan, the youngest, 1957. Then there's Jack and Steve in between. The hard work that he did on Capitol Hill had a toll. He's often known also as having the all-American family. And indeed, in many respects, he does. But we all know that all-American families also have, at times, problems, challenges. And here, Mrs. Ford was raising 4 kids in the middle of the 1960s, the turbulent 1960s. And yet, her husband is gone so much. By the time he moves into leadership, earns the minority leader's position in 1964, he could be gone over 200 days of the year, promoting the Republican agenda and campaigning for Republican members of Congress. And that was hard on her. And when she began to speak, gained a larger platform as the second lady and as the first lady, and she talked with newspaper reporters, she was open about the psychiatric help that she sought in the middle part of the 1960s to help restore a sense of her self-worth and how effective that was. So it's not all rosy. There are challenges that the Fords have to go through, but they tackle them and they move on. If we go to the next slide, Ford still seeking that speakership. And by 1964, the Republicans took a shellacking on Capitol Hill. 1966, 2 years into his minority leadership, they made great strides in recovering those numbers. 1968, the Republican Party secures the presidency in a razor-thin election. His friend, Richard Nixon, is elected to the presidency. There he is in Kent County campaigning alongside candidate Nixon in his home district. And then once Nixon begins his administration, Gerald Ford, as the minority leader, is working closely with the White House to advance the Nixon agenda on Capitol Hill to help him shape that agenda as well. So then 1972, Nixon wins this historic landslide election. But the needle barely moves for the Republicans on Capitol Hill. He has very short coattails, to put it in political parlance. And then Ford realizes that his dream of becoming Speaker probably is not going to happen. So he and Betty have a talk. They decide in 1974 he would stand for election once again, and then to help see the Nixon administration promote its agenda in his second term. And then in 1976, they would retire and return to Grand Rapids. Next slide. History intervenes. Ford well, I haven't even mentioned Watergate during this time, but Watergate begins to bubble in 1972. And 1973, Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, has to step down, not for reasons related to Watergate, but for other reasons. And President Nixon gets to exercise a provision of the 25th Amendment, which had been ratified in 1967, that allows the president to nominate a person to fill the vacancy of the vice presidency, should it occur, with the advice and the consent of Congress. And as a tribute to Gerald Ford's bipartisanship, when after the Congress has its hearings and they get around to voting late November, early December of 1973, there are only 35 members of the House who vote against Gerald Ford. There are only 3 members of the Senate who vote against Gerald Ford, probably about as close to acclamation as you can get on Capitol Hill. So by December 1973, Ford has moved from the House of Representatives to becoming president of the Senate, vice president of the United States. And he holds that position for 8 months. Then Nixon, in August of 1974, himself resigns, and Ford becomes president of the United States. I like this image of this French magazine that promotes a new America. And there's the new president seated in his, and Betty Ross fashion, not making, Betsy Ross fashion, not making the American flag, but mending the American flag. And above him are 2 images from his 1948 Congressional campaign. It's not just America who wants to know more about their new president who has come in this unique way to the office, but it's the world who wants to know something about this new president of the United States. So we go to the next slide. What they find out is that he was not born in Michigan, and he was not born Gerald Ford. He was born Leslie Lynch King Jr. on July 14, 1913. There's on the right side, there is this child with his mother in the bed on which he was born. On the left side, the house in which he was born, that's his mother's father-in-law's house. She had married Leslie Lynch King in 1912. And 1913, they have their one and only child. Leslie King proves himself to be a liar, someone who is physically and mentally abusive. 2 weeks after the child is born, Mrs. Dorothy King secrets the child out of the house onto a train and off to Chicago, then over to Grand Rapids, where her parents are developing real estate. She sues for divorce. In December of 1913, that divorce is granted by the court. So we go to the next slide. In the two years later, she has met a paint salesman at a church picnic, a fellow by the name of Gerald Ford. You see him on the left side, and you see Junior in front of him. And she marries him in February of 1917. And an evolution, a rolling evolution of Ford's name begins at that time. He's known during this period as Junior King. And then when he goes into school at 5 years old, he enrolls in school as Junior King Ford. And then by the time he gets into middle school, he's just known as Junior Ford. And by the time he graduates from high school and 1931 and goes into the University of Michigan, then he's known as Gerald Ford Jr. And in 1935, he and his father his stepfather petitioned the courts to have his name changed officially to Gerald Rudolph Ford Jr. There's never an adoption. But there is this official name change at the end. His mother and his father, his stepfather, are very active in Grand Rapids. His father moves from being a paint salesman to starting his own paint and varnish company. And they both, mother and father, teach their children. Ford has 3 half-brothers also, teach their children their moral and civic responsibilities, their duties to their community. One of the organizations that Ford Sr. Appreciated was Boy Scouts, which was relatively new at the time. And for 4 years, Ford Jr. Gives himself over to the Boy Scouts. By the time he's 14 years old, he's earned his Eagle Badge. You see him on Mackinac Island with one of his fellow Eagle Scouts in 1927. And then he also learns from his parents the virtues of hard work. And as the Depression rolls in, he takes jobs, and one of them was at a restaurant, a burger joint across the street from his high school, where he worked during his lunch hour, and then in the evenings and on weekends as well. You see him there positioned between 2 of his colleagues. And it's at that restaurant called Bill's Place where he first meets his birth father. You see his birth father on the right, Leslie King, who shows up one day and says, "I'm your father," and then takes Junior out to lunch and talks with him, encourages him to move with him to Wyoming, where he's living. And Ford says that was the darkest night of his youth. He talks about that to Hersey. Hersey writes about it in his article and in his book. He talks about it with Dick Cavett in a television interview, and then writes about it in his memoirs. It was the darkest night of his youth because he had to go home and tell his parents what had just happened. It was an emotional, traumatic experience for him. Next slide. This is film, and if you, Keneal, if you would go ahead and start it, we're only going to show about the first minute and a half of it. This was film that just serendipitously was found by the archivist at the Special Collections of the Grand Rapids Public Library. He called me up and he said, "Hey, I found this film. I think you'd be interested in seeing it." And it was film shot by the father of one of the players on the Ottawa High School team. Gerald Ford attended South High, and here we see in 1929 a football match between Ottawa High School and South High. It's the first game of the season. South High kicks off in the dark uniforms and the light gray uniforms. Ottawa receives Gerald Ford. This is his junior year. He's playing in here, and the film is good enough that you can look at it slide by slide, frame by frame, and find number 23 in it. Ford would become the captain of the team the next year, his senior year, all-state player. They would earn the state championship. And I'm going to come up here in just a minute. I'm going to freeze frame so that you can see the only known footage of Gerald Ford playing high school football. Just a minute, you'll see number 23 coming in from the right-hand side. Slow it down, and there he is. There's Junior Ford, number 23, his junior year. And so we can go ahead and stop it there, and we can go on to the next slide. But that's some unique film there. And Ford would parlay that fame on the football field to admission to the University of Michigan. They recruited him to play football. At this time, the Big Ten did not offer scholarships. Ford had to work his way through high school. Through college. It took the community to get him there and to help hold him there for the 4 years. And you see him playing against Michigan State. He would be named the most promising player his freshman year, the most valuable player his senior year. He would sit on the bench for 2 years behind an All-American center, Chuck Bernard. And when the team goes undefeated and earns 2 national championships, but then he would become the starter his senior year. And he would take the lessons from football with him into adulthood. And he writes about these. Patience, taught him patience, it taught him teamwork, it taught him the give and take necessary to achieve goals, part of that bipartisan quality of his. But he would take with him friendships from Delta Kappa Epsilon. And that's the image on the right. The fraternity house to which he belonged, it really was the animal house of the University of Michigan. It was the party house. It lived on the edge of being decertified and kicked off campus. They had about the lowest cumulative GPA of any of the Greek houses. They were known for the parties that they gave, and it was a camaraderie and friendship that Ford loved. He was never going to be the life of the party. He was never going to be the one wearing the lampshade, but he enjoyed that sort of fraternal activity. But it's friends here that he would take with him into adulthood. If you can see him, he's on the first row on the right-hand side, second from the end, and the fellow sitting next to him on the very end is Jack Beckwith. Jack Beckwith would be his best man at his wedding and would be the namesake of his second son, Jack Ford. And then a couple of rows back on that third row, left side, second from the end on the left-hand side is Jack Stiles, who would be a close friend, was from Grand Rapids, would be an advisor to him in his congressional years, an unofficial advisor to him in his presidency, work on his campaign in 1976, but unfortunately die in an automobile accident before the primaries, the end of the primary season in 1976. He took lessons from the football field. He took friendships from Delta Kappa Epsilon. And let's go to the next slide. And he leaves the University of Michigan with three football offers to play professional football from the Packers, the Bears, and the Lions. But he turns them down to go to Yale, where he would become the assistant football coach, the junior varsity football coach, and of all things, the boxing coach. He knew nothing of boxing, but before he left for Yale, he stopped at the YMCA in Grand Rapids, took some boxing lessons so he would know a little bit about the language, a little bit about the moves, and hopefully enough to fool the rest of the team. Well, he stays with it. And he stays at Yale for about 5.5, 6 years. And these are the years that really we don't know a whole lot about Ford. We don't know as much about Ford as we would like to. There's still a lot of work to be done here, productive work. But we do know this is where he learns to play tennis. He learns to play golf. He learns to ski and to play bridge, becomes an excellent bridge player. He is exposed to New York. He's dating one of the top models in New York City and ends up in some of the magazine spreads with her. He works on the 1940s Wendell Willkie campaign, the 1940 Wendell Willkie campaign. And it's here also that he gave voice to his isolationism. And as World War II was boiling in Europe and over in the Pacific, taking shape, Ford was part of what was the majority opinion in the United States at that time, and that was isolationism. We're staying out of the war. And so he helped found the America First chapter at Yale, worked to help other campuses establish them. But even as he begins to leave Yale, he seems to be letting loose of that position, and it changes. And if we go to the next slide, as happened with so many in America in World War II, shed him of his isolationist position, and he makes the transition to an internationalist. He would go in as an ensign, come out as a lieutenant commander in 1946. 1943, 1944, he spends mostly on an aircraft carrier in the Pacific. And we might know, because he talked about it, him coming close to losing his life in the tornado that struck Halsey's fleet in December of 1944. But a closer examination of his time aboard the USS Monterey shows just the intense amount of action that he actually saw at the Gilberts, at Cavite, and the Carolinas, in the Marshalls, at Saipan, off the Philippines, and Formosa. He earns 8 battle stars. He is the athletic officer, the gunnery, a gunnery officer, and then the assistant navigator as well. And you see him on the left-hand side, he's going up for the rebound. He's the one on the left going up for that rebound, and then with the sextant, and then I think that image is off of Formosa as a Japanese torpedo plane is bearing down on the Monterey, and they're returning fire. So he comes back in 1946, and his interest in politics is stoked. Interest in reforming politics in Grand Rapids in the state of Michigan is also prominent, and he begins to shape his career. So we go to the next slide. He goes into Congress. We've rehearsed that. He ends up in the presidency. And unfortunately, at this time, too often, Ford is seen as something of a placeholder, a steward, if you will, somebody keeping the chair warm, as some write about him. After Nixon, anticipating Carter and Ronald Reagan. But his presidency is 895 days, and the presidency is so much more than that. As he comes into office, he has to select his own vice president. He has to deal with what he's going, decide what he's going to do with the Nixon cabinet and how he's going to shape his own cabinet. And that's going to take a while. We know in September he pardons Richard Nixon. What we might overlook is that 2 weeks after that is when Betty Ford goes in for a routine exam, finds out that she has cancer, and ends up in the hospital in what is the darkest night of his presidency. That night he spends alone in the White House, anticipating her surgery the next day. But he's also dealing with inflation at this time, with inflation now. And with SALT talks, you see him there as pictured in November, Vladivostok, meeting with Brezhnev as he's advancing the strategic arms limitations talk, hoping for a SALT II agreement. He's also dealing with the crisis in Cyprus between two NATO allies, Turkey and Greece. We go to the next slide, and the final slide, again, just how crowded his 895 days are and how consequential they are. He has to pivot quickly in December of 1974 into January of 1975 from dealing with inflation to dealing with a recession, a mounting recession. Vietnam is falling apart. Even as Hersey is sitting in that office following him for that week in March, Vietnam is falling apart. In April, we vacate from it. He's receiving Amerasian children there in an Operation Baby Lift in early April of 1975. Then in May of that year, the Cambodian seizure of the SS Mayaguez he has to deal with throughout the summer into the fall, the New York City crisis. You see the daily headlines. One of the things also that comes to us from the Ford administration that we remember, because that headline is reprised so often in different ways today, Ford to city drop dead. What we fail to account for is that the same editor who wrote that headline also wrote the endorsement for Gerald Ford in the 1976 general election. And we fail to remember also all the other cities that were facing similar crises to New York City, who were watching how the Ford administration dealt with that and pivoting themselves, but also the Reagan challenge that emerges later in 1975, and then the campaign in 76, the bicentennial celebrations of 1976. But I want to leave with this. Betty Ford, in that famous picture, her striking a dance pose on the table of the cabinet room, and a lot of people write about the statement that this makes, considering Betty Ford and her strong advocacy for women in the administration. She said the one disappointment that she had was that she wasn't able to get a woman on the Supreme Court, but Carla Hills was Housing and Urban Development Secretary in Ford's cabinet. There were other women appointed to other positions. Anne Armstrong was considered for the vice presidency. But I want to take a different take on this. She's in company with David Kennerly, the chief White House photographer, and this image was taken on January 19, 1977, their last full day in the White House. What she is doing is she's taking a tour of the White House, and she is meeting with the White House staff, as many as she can find, thanking them for having made the White House her home, having welcomed her into the people's house and making it her home over the past 2.5 years. And it recalls something that Gerald Ford did on his first day in the White House. For 2 weeks, he commuted from his home in Alexandria as the Nixon material was being taken out of the residence of the White House. And on the first day, his limousine pulls up, he jumps out of the door, walks up to the north entrance of the White House where a Marine guard is standing at attention, and he sticks out his hand to the Marine, shakes his hand and says, "Hello, I'm Jerry Ford. I'm going to be living here for a while. What's your name?" And that's just Ford. Those qualities that he brought with him from Grand Rapids, that he learned with his parents, that were crafted on Capitol Hill, that constituent service that he placed so much importance on. People criticize him for not pivoting, for continuing to be a congressman while he was president. But those congressional qualities we ought not to overlook, because they served him so well in dealing with the people while he was president, also dealing with foreign leaders and others, that personal quality that both he and Betty shared, an appreciation for the common folk. And so, Patrick, that's the presentation. I hope I didn't go too long, but
no, it's
thank you.
Fantastic. And you covered a lot of ground, as they say. So we have a few questions have come in. I want to encourage folks to use the YouTube chat to ask your questions there, and want to welcome folks from all over the country. Savannah, Georgia. We got folks from the DC area, Alexander, Arlington, Fairfax Station, DC, Dagsboro, Delaware, Jenison, Michigan, Palo, Ohio, Cherry Hill, New Jersey, Alamosa, Colorado, Rock Chalk, which I'm not sure where that is, Palos Verdes, California, Riverview, Florida, Connecticut. A lot of Jerry Ford fans out there, which is fantastic. Well, let me start off while the questions are getting in the queue here. Let me start out with something we've been talking about in a lot of these conversations with presidential libraries, and even we also have a series on First Ladies we've been doing, is about legacy. So obviously over the last year, the country's really been looking at the legacy of our founders and how people are looking through a different lens now. And so can you talk a little bit, especially since you've had a fairly long career at the Ford Museum, about how his legacy has changed maybe from when he first came out of office, that the lens we look through now? I know you mentioned the McCullough quote, but I'm curious and your take about his legacy.
It's growing, and I think it really began to change with the attention that McCullough shined on him, if briefly. But then after his passing, he passed away on December 26, 2006, and then over that holiday, the remainder of that holiday, we had his funeral. His body lay in state at the Capitol. And the service, there were services in California, in Washington, D.C., and in Grand Rapids. The television coverage of that followed. And I think the outpouring that Grand Rapids gave him when he arrived, when the casket arrived and lay in state at the museum for 17 hours overnight, thousands and thousands of people lined up and stood in line for hours and hours to pay their respects to him. And the cameras rolled and showed that and talked about this town, Grand Rapids. And he lived for 30 years in his post-presidency. And that's long enough, in some respects, it's long enough to be forgotten, but people recalled. And it called to mind also something David Broder wrote about Ford after he left office, that he was the kind of person we always wanted as president and didn't know that we had. And I think that has sort of burnished his image and helped his legacy. He's a pivotal president. That he begins deregulation. And we often credit that to Carter and to Reagan, rightfully, even George Bush. But it begins in the Ford White House. He makes this break with the sort of the FDR legacy, and so telecommunications, deregulation of telecommunications, of transportation, the airlines, this begins in the Ford administration, and it's carried forward through the remainder of the 1970s, 1980s, into the 1990s. So in a number of ways. And what we need are more biographies of Ford. And I will just throw a plug out there that I think we can anticipate next year Richard Norton Smith publishing a lengthy biography of Gerald Ford, which should come out hopefully in the summer of next year.
Terrific. Starting to get a few questions in, so I want to make sure we get a chance to answer some of them. The Ford family, and this is a common question we get when we have the Presidential Library folks on. Are the family members involved with the library, the museum? If so, how?
They are, and even they got more involved, of course, after President Ford passed away, and then after Mrs. Ford passed away in 2011. Marty Allen, who had been the longtime chairman of the Gerald R. Ford Foundation, stepped down about that time. Jack Ford became the chairman of the Ford Foundation and active with activities at the library and the museum for about 3 years. And then Steve Ford took up that mantle for a while. Jack Ford is, Mike Ford is the chairman right now. And Susan plays an important part. She was sponsor of the USS Gerald R. Ford. She's active in the many of the programs that we have, exhibits that we do. They have been very supportive. They and the foundation have been very supportive of the library and the museum in the exhibits, programs, and digitization also efforts.
Did you, you touched about Betty Ford's, obviously the cancer experience. In the museum itself, is there, do you talk about that? And then obviously later on, the addiction connection, what kind of narrative do you have in the museum about Betty Ford?
Yeah, we're fortunate to have a first lady who was so open as Betty Ford was, who was willing to talk about the problems. Because as she said, I assume if I'm having these problems, others are having these problems also, and they might benefit from that. So we renovated the core exhibits in 2016 and increased Betty Ford's footprint in that. And so we talk a great deal about her advocacy on behalf of women's rights, the Equal Rights Amendment, the breast cancer, the Betty Ford Clinic in her post-First Ladyship, her advocacy for the arts, and particularly American art and dance, but also her advocacy for children who are suffering health problems, mental problems, handicapped children. When she first came to Washington, she adopted the Hospital for Sick Children, which is just outside of DC. And she stayed with that throughout her time in Washington. It harkened back to a hospital here in Grand Rapids, Mary Free Bed, that her mother was an important part of and that she worked at herself. That's been a long ongoing concern for Mrs. Ford. So yeah, we talk quite a bit about her. Not as much as we'd like to, but as much as space allows.
Sure. You talked a little bit about obviously his role in Congress. I'm curious to talk a little bit about relations. So it's a two-part question. I'll let you answer it in whichever order you prefer. His relationship with Ronald Reagan, obviously he beats him and then loses to Carter, and Reagan takes another shot at it and ends up winning, going 2 terms. So I'm curious about that, just so the interpersonal relationship there. And then you talked about Congress and obviously so the deregulation and so forth, but I read somewhere in preparation for this that he vetoed 66 pieces of Democratic legislation because he disagreed with the fiscal approach, which seemed like a large number these days. But can you sort of talk about his relationship with Congress, obviously having served in Congress?
Yeah, perhaps I can answer that part in unison, and those two questions in unison. Ronald Reagan hammered Ford for this ballooning budget on Capitol Hill as he made a bid to unseat Ford in the primary in 1976. Ford was left just scratching his head saying, just imagine how big it would have been if I hadn't vetoed all those bills. He vetoed 66 bills while he was president. It was the one effective means he had for exercising some control over what was a Democrat Capitol Hill with strong majorities in both the House and the Senate. But it was also at a time when there was a greater mix among Democrats. Southern Democrats and Northern Democrats were quite different. So there were imaginative ways that he could craft blocks of either effective minorities or effective majority positions on Capitol Hills, even among Democrats. He did not know Reagan that well. Ronald Reagan had been governor of California, and Ford on Capitol Hill didn't mix that much with governors. And so he didn't know Ronald Reagan that well. He certainly hoped that Reagan would not challenge him. But Reagan had run in 1968 and had come close in 1968 and considered himself next in line. It was his turn and Ford was in the way. And Ford had come to this office in an odd sort of way. And so he needed to get out of the way and let Reagan run. Well, Ford had hoped that he could craft a way to persuade Reagan to not run against him. And that same month that Hersey is there in March of 1975, he and Mrs. Ford later that month fly out to California for an event, meet with the Reagans, have dinner with them, small talk, in hopes of just, trying to, in a soft way, persuade him not to run. Mrs. Ford writes later that after they left that dinner, that they were both convinced Ronald Reagan's going to run. So it was a testy relationship forged in that primary, but it was one. Remember, in 1980, there were strong indications that Ronald Reagan might pick Gerald Ford as his vice president. There was a headline in a Chicago newspaper touting that very thing. They thought better of. They talked about it. They thought better of it, and both decided that wasn't the right course. But Ford was supportive of Reagan during his 4 years. His 8 years in the White House.
Great. A couple more questions from the our Q&A here. And can you talk a little bit about his role and participation in the Warren Commission?
If you sort of tally up the amount of time that each of the 7 commissioners gave to the Warren Commission, nobody's going to top Earl Warren. He gives the most amount of time. But Ford is a close second. Something of for some, a controversial pick. Ford had a relationship with the FBI. There were those who made the allegation that Ford was sort of the mouth and ears, eyes for the FBI on that commission. There's nothing of that. There's no evidence of it. Ford and Earl Warren flew to Dallas to question Jack Ruby after Jack Ruby had killed Oswald, and questioned him at length, and met with Mrs. Oswald and met with Marguerite, Oswald's mother. He did a lot of work, produced a book, Jack Stiles, that fellow that I pointed out, and he wrote a book, I think it came out in 1966, called Portrait of the Assassin, Oswald. He believed in the conclusions that the Warren Commission published. He helped shape those conclusions, crafting the language that said there is no evidence of any other participation, of any collusion, of any other players, that that the evidence indicates Oswald is the lone assassin. He believed Oswald to be the lone assassin, but he was very also open with those critics and would say, and I heard him say on any number of occasions, that if you have evidence, bring it forward. We're still willing to consider it. But in the absence of any other evidence, the conclusions stand.
Terrific. Let me see if I can stick a couple more in here before we have to wrap up. Can you talk to us about why did he dump Rockefeller as VP in '76?
It was a tough decision, and it was one, Ford made principled decisions, but he could also make political decisions that had political calculus behind them, and that was one of them. He wrote himself how he wished he had stood up to the right wing of the Republican Party and said, no, it's going to be Ford Rockefeller, and you need to accept that. But he and Rockefeller had a meeting in the Oval Office discussing the obvious problem that the polls revealed, that with Rockefeller, there was a good chance that Gerald Ford was going to lose the primaries. And Rockefeller said, listen, if you want my resignation, as Ford remembered the conversation, Rockefeller said, if you want my resignation, you'll have it. And Ford said, well, it would be easier if I had it. And so Rockefeller bowed out of the ticket. It's interesting that as the convention in Kansas City approached, Reagan's big stumble was over the vice presidency as well, when he selected Schweiker and made that announcement before the convention began, and that was his undoing.
So, sure. So let me give you a chance to answer questions come through, but you teased it earlier about the actual facilities. Why are they in two different sites?
Okay, when Ford moved into leadership in 1964 as the minority leader in Congress, he struck an agreement with his alma mater to house his papers. So he began archiving his papers at the Bentley Library at the University of Michigan. And that continued through the rest of his time when he, as a congressman. When he became vice president, he extended the agreement to his vice presidential papers as well. But then he becomes president, and now he can build a presidential library. He wants to keep his commitment to the University of Michigan, so he builds his library there. But he wants to do something for his hometown and the heart of his 5th district in West Michigan, and so he builds his museum over there. Sort of breaks up synergy of the staff. It's that good bipartisan decision, where you split the baby. But the Solomon-like decision, where it's actually put into effect, it has its challenges. It has its benefits also. We have a presence over the state of Michigan, but it does present challenges for people who want to visit the Gerald R. Ford Library and end up in Ann Arbor, hoping to see the museum, hoping to see the exhibits. We do offer some exhibits at the library, but we do labor with that split facility.
Sure. So we've got two last questions here. One, and we'll throw something up on the screen you referenced, is football, high school and college prowess. But as you are well aware, there's a document here from a Curly Lambeau that is, I think we have a zoom in of this, offering him this job to play for the Packers. So I did a little research. The Packers, they were doing pretty good there in the late 30s, early 40s. The Lions were kind of middling, and the Bears were always there. So he had 3 offers from some of the top clubs in the I guess before the NFL. And I'm just curious if you had any comment, if you think if he went to the Lions, would they have had a shot at the Packers?
Sure, they would have. Of course, of course they would have. He was not an All-American. That Gerald Ford wasn't. He was an All-Star, and so he goes to. He was selected to appear in the East-West Shrine game in San Francisco, and he takes the train out there with the team. They practice along the way, and all of these NFL team owners and coaches were on this train with these All-American, All-Star players, and nobody's paying any attention to him. And with his luck, the game starts and he's playing backup center. The center in the first couple of snaps damages his knee, has to come out, and Ford plays the remainder of the game and does a stellar job of it, such that on the train back, Lambeau and others are seated next to Ford, cajoling him, trying to get him to sign on the dotted line. But he puts them off and then eventually turns them down because he wants to go to Yale. He goes to Yale without the promise of the entry into law school, but because he has a job with the athletic department, and then petitions the law school for entry, which he eventually earns.
Very good. And then on another sort of light-spirited one, I wanted to bring up Chevy Chase here. So Gerald Ford is spoofed a little bit on Saturday Night Live, opting not to show any clips today, but just these couple of things.
Thank you.
Clumsy and so forth. So, is that just unfair? Is that sort of a hazard of being president and being under the microscope? What is there any truth to Saturday Night Live's take on President Ford?
There's a grain of truth in any caricature, in any good caricature. And I'm not saying that Chevy Chase was good at caricature. I will say that Ford laughed it off. I will say also that it got under Ford's skin because he was arguably the most accomplished athlete ever to occupy the Oval Office. I mean, as you pointed out, 3 offers to play professional football, and a natural at just about any sport that he picked up. He had bad knees because he played football. He had an operation on one knee and an operation on the other knee, and so he had weaker knees that would occasionally bother him, particularly as the weather changed. And he had the unfortunate experience of bumping his head on a Marine One as he was getting out of it, and then hitting somebody with a golf ball, in which you swing the club often enough, that's going to happen, particularly if people line the fairways. Well, yes, it was unfair. Yes, it was part of the turf. Ford understood it as that. He had a conference at the library, at the museum, Humor in the Presidency, and he invited Chevy Chase to it. And so we've got a nice picture of him tripping Chevy Chase.
That's excellent. Excellent. Well, Don, this has been terrific. I know our audience has appreciated it. We've really added to our Presidential Library series. Before I let you go, obviously, hopefully reopening soon, so we encourage folks to visit your website and so forth. But is there anything you can tell us about, assuming all goes well, with health numbers and we reopen, but over the fall or next year, are there anniversaries of things that the museum and the Presidential Library are planning for that folks might put on their calendar?
Yeah, I would just say keep your eyes open and your pen ready to write these things down. But in September of this year, we celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Library and Museum. We will see how we are able to do that. We're hoping that we can do that in a full-throated way, and God willing, we will. But also, we're moving into, as we get into 2022, the 50th anniversary of the break-in at the Watergate Hotel, and the 50th anniversaries of the Ford administration rolling out. And I know the foundation is focusing closely on making the most of those opportunities that are coming up. So I would say stay tuned. You'll be seeing things roll out as we get this pandemic behind us, get back to full business, and begin celebrating the anniversaries, not just of the library and the museum, but of the Ford presidency.
Terrific. Lots to look forward to. Anniversaries are coming up, so that's always a good opportunity for the presidential libraries. Again, thank you for your time today and all your insights, your contribution, a great presentation. And for our viewers, I just have a few last closing announcements. We appreciate all of you that have joined us, especially our members, corporate supporters, and our donors. If you are not a member of the foundation, you can join today by visiting our website, archivesfoundation.org. Also want to thank my staff who make these programs happen, my program, logistics, prep, and production gurus, Kenil McDonald and Taylor Collison. And let's not forget, Father's Day is only a few weeks away. And after we wrap this program up, please go visit the best museum shop in DC and online, nationalarchivesstore.org. Select that gift and get it shipped off to him before the holidays. And we have a ton of programs coming up in June. And actually, even next week on May 26th at 5 o'clock, we'll host a program called Black Wall Street, The Hidden Economy, where we'll be discussing how Black entrepreneurs created wealth in their communities across the country in the 1800s, early 1900s, the Tulsa Race Massacre, with representatives, historians, representatives of the Black Chamber of Commerce, and entrepreneurs who can talk about some of the challenges entrepreneurs face today. Even so I hope you'll join us for that next week. And then on June 2nd, we have at 7 p.m. actually join the National Archives for a program with Annette Gordon-Reed discussing her new book on Juneteenth. That'll be a terrific program and conversation. Then I'm back on June 10th at 5 p.m. with a conversation with civil rights leader and attorney for Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King, Fred Gray. This will be a fascinating discussion. I've been reading his book in preparation for it. He has got some amazing stories to share with you. And then on June 22nd at 5 p.m., we'll celebrate the 50th anniversary of the 26th Amendment with a program focusing on young women and the vote. And I'm going to tease one other program, which we don't have a date for, but will also be in June. So as I always say, register, join now, and follow us on social media. Sign up for our email so you know everything that's coming up. The National Archives is our nation's memory. What is past is prologue. And until next time, thank you on behalf of the National Archives Foundation.